A very good evening to all our viewers today. Today we have with us a very distinguished and accomplished professional. He has worked for 15 years in Switzerland-based multinational ABB, 10 years as the head of corporate social responsibility. He has a diverse background. He has also been a broadcaster at BBC and is presently working in the space of human rights and sustainability agenda as the CEO of Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. We all would like to welcome Mr. Ron Popper.
Thank you very much, Harsha. Nice to be with you, at least virtually, and welcome to all of you. My background is really in business and human rights, and the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights that I lead is a group of 20 plus multinational companies that are seeking to embed respect for human rights in their business everyday activities. Difficult issues, a lot of problems that we come across, but also we share tools, we share ways of thinking to help embed respect for human rights in business. I think I'd like to just briefly mention three issues which I think are really important and which may be of interest to you. First of all, I think the pace of change in the business and human rights and the sustainability world in general is extraordinary at the moment. The last 2 or 3 years, I think, have seen the introduction of a lot of standards, a lot of new legislation, which is actually going to affect our business and the way in which we do business. Just to give you one example of that, in Europe at the moment, we have several countries, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, no doubt one or two others, that have introduced new business and human rights legislation, which not only force their own national companies to do better in terms of respecting human rights, but also place a great deal of emphasis on the supply chain and suppliers and business partners in all parts of the world to really know and be able to show what they're doing to respect human rights. Now, this isn't just a sort of nice tick box exercise to make people feel good. This is the ability of suppliers and business partners in future in India and wherever they're doing business with Europe or inside Europe, they will have to show what they're doing in very clear terms to respect human rights as a condition for doing business, as a condition for business continuity. So I think that's a very radical development. And in the next few weeks, we will see an EU-wide directive on business and human rights, which will again place emphasis on not just European countries behaving well, but also as a condition for future business, companies from outside Europe having to really know and show what their impacts are on human beings. The second thing that I would like briefly to mention is the issue of leadership. As Harsha kindly mentioned, I worked for 10 years in a multinational, which is also present in India, as head of corporate responsibility, looking after human rights issues and difficult dilemmas as well, some of them in India. And it is really important to get things done within a corporation, as I'm sure you all know, but I would like to stress it, that we have the right kind of leadership, the right kind of tone from the top. Unless you have the right kind of leadership, really pushing the social, the sustainability, the human rights agenda within the company, it will be a kind of half-hearted effort. It will lack that kind of management backup, which then ensures that it's embedded in policies, processes, and indeed the culture of the company. So I'm always very happy when I hear of a business leader who understands the agenda, who understands the value to business, understands the value to business resilience and continuity and relationships, and drives it through his or her business organization. And the third thing that I would like to mention, it's an issue that's close to my heart. We face a real alphabet soup of different terms. We have CSR, we have the SDGs, we have the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We have the ESG, and. You know, we could fill this space with acronyms. And it's very important that when we use this terminology, we know exactly what we're talking about. I went through an experiment several times where I asked colleagues, what do you understand by CSR? What do you understand by sustainability? And I tell you, I asked 10 colleagues and I got 11 different answers. So I think CSR is not a term I particularly like. I know it's applicable in certain areas, but in Europe, we don't use CSR much anymore. If we want to talk about philanthropy, fine, we talk about philanthropy. If we talk about doing good through social projects, we talk about that. If we talk about human rights, we talk about human rights. Similarly, sustainability, do we mean the social dimension? Do we mean environment? And if so, if we mean environment, do we mean our own environmental impact or our technology, or what do we mean? So when my speciality is on business and human rights, and there I draw on the UNGPs, the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and I really focus on that. And I suppose what I'm saying is, instead of using terms very loosely, let us be very specific about what we really mean about our impacts, our contributions, and the ways in which we can support social and environmental progress. I do find too many leaders talk about sustainability, and I'm sure they feel comfortable talking about sustainability with each other, but do they really know what they are talking about or what they want to convey? So I suppose what I'm saying is a plea to be very specific in the kind of issues that we work on, in order to avoid confusion among the people we work with, and to ensure that we're very specific about what kind of impacts, positive and negative, that we can have. So those were my introductory remarks, and I just wanted to stir things up a little bit. And I'm happy to take any kind of questions anyone wants to throw at me, Harsha.
Okay, the first question is, you worked in the media industry for 26 years, including working with BBC Worldwide Service as editor for international news and current affairs.
Yeah.
Now, what made you shift in the space of sustainability, CSR, and human rights? What led it?
Well, it was a kind of transition. So I did 26 years in newspapers and in radio, which I enjoyed hugely. And I traveled the world. I came to India many times. I've been to many parts of India. And then an opportunity arose to join a multinational in corporate communications. So I was segueing from journalism to corporate communications. And after a very short space of time in corporate communications, I ended up going into issues management, how to manage some very difficult issues. And actually, they were already human rights issues. So I segued into the human rights space that way.
Wonderful. You have also worked with ABB Group, and you focused on robotics, power, heavy electrical equipment, and automation technology areas for about 10 years as head of CSR. So, what were the challenges that you faced over the period of time?
Numerous. And I'm not here, I don't work for ABB anymore, and I'm not here to act as a spokesman or a critic of them. And the challenges I will mention are actually common to many companies that are part of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights as well. So, is there good leadership? Is there the tone from the top, which is going to drive corporate responsibility through the company, from the top through to the sales force, through to supply chain, and so forth? Working in difficult environments. So, what extra measures do you need to put in place if you're working in a conflict or post-conflict zone? How do you look after your people as well, particularly in dangerous or post-conflict societies? How do you work with the supply chain? Huge issue for all companies, and I'm sure companies on this call know the dilemmas as well as I do. How do you ensure that people in your supply chain are treated fairly, that they receive a decent wage, that their living conditions are satisfactory, that they're not exploited, that national law, which may look very good on paper, is implemented? These kind of issues arise very regularly. And if you're a global company, things move very fast indeed. So particularly in the internet age, good news travels fast, but so does bad news. And so if there is criticism of an international company, say in the Philippines, it arrives at head office within nanoseconds. And how to react to that, how to do due diligence on that kind of incident or criticism, how to provide a fair response. All these kind of issues come up on a daily basis or on a regular basis, shall we say, in a multinational company. How to react to a very fast changing environment, allegations that may be true, may be false, so plenty of issues for everyone within a multinational or within a company to grapple with on a daily basis. How do you treat your workers as well? Not just supply chain, but your own workers. Discrimination, harassment, bullying, gender discrimination, racial, caste, ethnic discrimination. All these issues come up on a very regular basis. Health and safety. I mean, a company has a duty of care to look after its people and people who earn it money. So how do you ensure that the health and safety precautions and PPE equipment is provided and used? Harsha, all these issues come up on a very regular basis in a multinational, as well as in many smaller companies.
I totally reckon with you. Now, as a global leader in human rights, what are the pressing challenges in the present world scenario as the times have changed pre-COVID, post-COVID, and during COVID?
So I think supply chain is a huge issue, and supply chain issues have become tougher as a result of COVID. Many companies have walked away from contracts, leaving people unemployed or really struggling. It's more difficult to do audits if you can't be present and do them in person. There are an awful lot of suppliers who are suffering the economic downturn caused by COVID, the loss of personnel. So huge issues around people and business continuity as well. I think some companies are also having to rethink their position on how they respond to human rights, how they respect human rights. Are we doing a good job? Are our workforce, are our suppliers satisfied? Are they going sick? Are they going absent? So I think the COVID epidemic, which has led to huge joblessness and increased poverty and increased child labour, it has to be said, is having a really bad effect and widening gulfs, economic gulfs that already exist, but exacerbating those, making them worse. So I think the human fallout from COVID-19 and different mutations which are now starting to surface will be felt for a long time to come. And we're just talking about the formal economy here, but the informal economy also, you can see some real social and socio-economic issues arising there, which are going to take a long time to overcome.
I totally understand, and especially India, considering most of us have unorganized economy and informal economy that we thrive on. My next question to you is, many companies limit their understanding of human rights to Child Labor and Slavery Act. What are the other components that we are missing, as it is mentioned in UNGP, or you would consider when you are doing human rights assessments?
Could I just revert 1 second and speak to a question in the chat?
Yes, please.
From Dr. Michael Hopkins, who I follow on LinkedIn. So thank you, Michael, for your question. So the human rights, your question is, yes, sure, I criticize the definitions because I find them sometimes too vague and not helpful. So what is human rights for me in a company, and how do you define leadership? So I'll take that. So human rights for me is the way in which a company can impact people positively and negatively. It's based on international law and legal definitions, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the UN and ILO conventions that have followed on a whole range of issues, as you know, child labour, indigenous peoples, and so forth. So for me, it's the issue is how to apply that to a company context. And you do a gap analysis and you find out what you've already got in place and what kind of processes and principles you're missing. And you look at the ways in which you can impact people and their human rights. You've got your processes on one side and your practices, and then you've got a list of all the human rights that can be impacted. To what extent are you geared up for that kind of activity? Now, I understand that there's a huge difference between multinationals' ability to work on these issues and some SMEs as well, the small and medium-sized enterprises. But nonetheless, those human rights exist everywhere. They're the same everywhere. They're not redefined. And it's a question of, the question is, how does the company act? And many companies now have human rights specialists working within their four walls and in the regions, and in different regions or in difficult environments, to go and do audits, to check on the extent to which company policies are being observed or not. So that's the way most companies, I'm being very simplistic here, but that's the way that most companies will look at their human rights performance. And how do I define leadership? Quite simply, under the UNGPs, there needs to be a person in executive management, whether it's board level or on an executive committee, who needs to take responsibility for human rights performance. And I like those companies that have got CEOs or board committees which set the tone and show what they require in terms of embedding respect for human rights in terms of processes and practices, and who make statements either publicly or within the company to drive a culture of respect for human rights. And who actually come down hard when issues surface or when people's rights are not respected. It takes many forms, as you know, Michael. Discrimination for me is one of them, and that in itself, as I itemized a few minutes ago, can take so many different forms. And can be very subtle, or it can be very crude. But it needs the tone from the top to clamp down on that kind of behavior and for people to understand why it's not acceptable. So that's a very quick answer to your question. Thank you for it. Harsha, can we just revert to your previous question?
Yes, please. So what are the other components in human rights that you see which are beyond slavery and child labor?
What are the issues, or which companies do I think are doing well?
Because the confinement of human rights knowledge is only about child labor or the Slavery Act. What are the other components that we are missing and which would be mentioned in UNGP and otherwise?
Yeah. Okay. So you need to go to the basic texts like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the international covenants to look at things like freedom of association, the right to form a union, the discrimination, freedom of religion, freedom of movement. Very important with the issue of migrant labor, particularly where migrant laborers I mean, there are many from India and parts of South Asia who go to the Gulf region to earn money, but end up as bonded labor under the kafala system in the Gulf. So freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of you look at the list in the Universal Declaration. There are 30 such freedoms which are irreversible and international and can't be reinterpreted. They are the basic rights with which we're born: the right to health, the right to life, the right to education. All these are basic human rights.
So which industries do you think are more vulnerable to human rights risk, and you know any methods, standardized methods to conduct the risk assessments for the same?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think there are different kinds of risks for different industries, but if I was to point my finger at 2 or 3 sectors, I would say the mining industry, the oil and gas industry, where it's not well regulated. I think agriculture, an issue you know well in India, the issue of agriculture and and labour and people working in the fields, under what conditions. And it's very easy for people to say, okay, this is something that is just happening in emerging economies, but actually it happens everywhere. It happens in Europe. If you look at agricultural workers in southern Italy producing tomatoes. If you look at agricultural workers in southern Spain or Portugal, the conditions under which they work are not do not conform with human rights. So there's agriculture, there are the extractive industries, in many cases also the textile industry as well. You can see some real cases in Asia and in Europe as well, has to be said, in the UK, in Italy, of workers being exploited. So there are several, but I think the ones that I would focus on are the extractives, agriculture and textile to start with.
Wonderful, Ron. I think so. Our friend Dr. Hopkins has something to say again. So, Dr. Hopkins, why don't you join in and ask your question, sir?
He has done.
Yes, and we have a question from others also, so let us address.
Okay, so it's Michael is talking about his new book.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can do.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. Harsha does this to me frequently, but we're very close friends. And
That's good.
In fact, when I saw you pop up today, I thought I've got to listen to you. Close to my heart. In fact, I've been working on my book all morning on all the issues you've mentioned. So unfortunately, I'm right up to date on all that stuff. Struggling through an unnamed reviewer who looked at my book. And as you were talking, I wondered if it was you, because they don't tell you who your peer reviewers are. Okay, well, it could well have been Ron. In that case, unfortunately, they were really, really very good and led me to a lot of extra work. So what can you do? But I think what you said is perfectly true. As you probably know from reading my stuff, is that I've been with CSR right from the beginning, and I love it and hate it in equal moments. But since I've always been with it, I try and work with it. And I have a very precise definition, which is treating key stakeholders responsibly. And of course, every word means something, what I mean by key, stakeholder, and all the rest of it, which I know you're very, very familiar with. So I was very, very happy to hear your question and response to mine. The one that I'm struggling with right now is sustainability. I'm actually teaching a course on that in several places right now, and to try and restrict myself to just one day in the course, because there's so many different aspects of it. I always start off with that definition. I tend to treat sustainability and CSR interchangeably, but I know that's not good for everybody. So just on sustainability, I'd like to ask you, what is your understanding, or is it just multifarious? And then, who are the key institutions that I mentioned in my question? Who are the key institutions? We now have World Economic Forum, the EU, we have SASB, we have GRI revised, all sorts of things. And very, very difficult for people to know exactly where to go, and also where to guide them, to be quite honest. So we're awaiting your guidance, Ron, and I promise not to ask any more questions.
You're very welcome, and I'd be actually happy to have a separate conversation with you offline. We've kind of known but not known each other for years.
Sure.
So I think there are all kinds of UN and ILO definitions out there that make sense to me. I come from an era, I've got the grey hair to show for it, of the triple bottom line thinking, the economic, social, and environmental mix forming the basis of sustainability. I think that still holds true, but we've obviously moved on a lot since then, and with all kinds of new definitions, but also new complexities as well, and new means of measuring performance. So the field has got a little bit muddied, but I'm always grateful to people who actually talk precisely about what they're talking about. Rather than, I hear so many CEOs and managers talking about, sustainable business. Well, do they mean green business, or do they mean business that's going to flourish, or et cetera, et cetera? Do they mean business that treats people well? So I get a little frustrated with some of the terminology, and hence my plea at the outset for very precise definitions to help guide us through this very complex period.
Totally agree with you. Harsh, I'm sure you've got lots of people ready to come in there, so I'll turn off my mouthpiece.
We'll talk another time, Michael.
I'd love to, Ron. Yeah, we're connected on LinkedIn, so we can meet each other there again.
Good.
We have a question from Mr. Rajesh Ingle about how can we talk about affirmative action at private sector?
How can we talk about what action? Sorry?
Affirmative action at private sector.
Yeah, this is again a term that I'm not fully conversant with, but I think the treatment of all our stakeholders in a respectful legal way will lead to that kind of appropriate action by companies. I think there are times where minorities or discriminated groups need additional support, and I think companies are actually in a good position. I mean, this should be government, of course, but companies are also in a position to make sure that there is a good balance, that there is good, that there's no discrimination within their four walls as well. So I think it needs enlightened management and also enlightened human resources departments to spot issues and also put in place practices which will restore the balance, really. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I hope so too. We have one more question from one of our viewers. How is ESG agenda linked to sustainability and CSR?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. Thank you very much for that. I think very closely linked. It's all part of this alphabet soup. So I think ESG is, the E is obviously environmental performance. The S is primarily human rights performance, plus the traditional CSR, social philanthropy piece. But the S is primarily how you behave towards human beings, how you respect their rights or not. And the G is obviously closely linked to the E and the S. You must have the right kind of governance in place in order to ensure that you can perform well in terms of environment and human rights. Interestingly, I think the E and the S are increasingly linked. Part of the E is certainly climate change, which has a huge impact on human rights, the ability of human beings to enjoy their basic rights, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to health, the right to food. So I'm in the process of driving an agenda of trying to ensure that environmental departments in companies and social departments, where social really refers to respect of human rights, work closer together, because I think that there are areas of overlap there. I regard CSR, and Michael won't like me for saying this, in many areas as a slightly outdated concept. I believe in philanthropy. I believe in being a good corporate citizen. I've been to India many times and in many areas, and I've seen wonderful projects in West Bengal, in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, Karnataka, and so forth. I believe in that, but I don't believe that that is a substitute or can compensate for poor human rights performance. Building a school doesn't offset a failure to respect human rights or an incident where you violate someone's human rights. It's not a sticking plaster. So I think these three are unfortunately sometimes interchangeable, but I think you just really need to define when you're talking about them what you mean by them.
I agree with you, and I hope Dr. Michaels, you would have something to say, do you?
Oh, hit on my favorite subject, Harsha. You're very naughty. I've been fighting against the philanthropic part of CSR for many years, and in fact, India started this off maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where their CSR was 2% of company profits, which was going to CSR projects.
Yes.
And Harsha and I have had so many arguments on that. It's not true, and I'm sure she could repeat some of them. It actually came from Mauritius originally, and in fact, I'm going to Mauritius next week. And normally Harsha joins us there, and we fight there as well. But in fact, what's happened with India is that the philanthropic thing has actually evolved. Their 2% is now to all activities related to CSR, which could be almost any stakeholder activity. So it's moved on, and I think we've had some success there. I think our discussions with Harsha and her team has brought that along. When I first started off with CSR, when I left the UN, everybody would say to me, "Oh, you're just a damn communist. You want all our companies to go away and become very, very social." And I said, "No, not at all." And I've always insisted that companies, it's not against profits, private profits, not at all, because I'm not against the private sector, but it's how you make your profits. And I think that's what we're talking about. And I think more and more we're succeeding along that line. I'm talking to you from Kenya, by the way, Ron. I don't know where you are, but are you in the UK somewhere?
Switzerland.
Are you in Geneva or somewhere?
Bern.
Oh, in Bern. You know, I live half my time in Geneva, so we should definitely get together. We definitely get together. I'm not there till April next. Mind you, with this new South African drive, where people coming from South Africa can't travel anymore because of the new COVID outbreak, which you might have heard about. I'm not quite sure about my own travel plans for the next few hours, let alone next week.
Just on the issue of philanthropy, Michael, I'm not against philanthropy at all. And I believe a lot of good can be derived from private and corporate philanthropy. And I think companies do need to be welcome in the environments in which they work, in the communities in which they work. But where I draw a line is those companies that use philanthropy as their S. And believe that by giving a certain amount to a good cause or providing a certain facility, that in a way compensates for any kind of negative impacts they may be having. That's where I think it really doesn't work at all.
I totally agree with you. And in fact, I always insisted on something called sustainable philanthropy. The reason sustainability came up, it was even in the 90s they were talking about it, is that companies like talking about corporate sustainability. I think even B&B at the time, with whom I was also working, obviously a company wants to be sustainable, so it's lovely, but they don't want to be corporate social. What do you mean by that? But not at all. But anyway, I've been pushing this idea of sustainable philanthropy, which by that I mean, how does it contribute to your bottom line? Where does it fit in? And if it doesn't, why are you doing it? And so generally, I always ask my companies to do that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I make the same point about human rights, respect for human rights. You know, the link is not immediate with your bottom line, but it is there. If you get human rights wrong, you will face legal cases, you will face reputational damage, you will face financial fallout, you will lose your attractiveness to current or potential employees, all of which have a financial impact on your bottom line. So I think human rights is very much linked, respect for human rights is very much linked to the corporate bottom line as well.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I actually tend to point out to my clients about long-term and short-term. I see most of this stuff as longer term. Now I have to define what I mean by longer term. I won't do it right now, but generally the idea is not actually to change a successful company from being successful. It's actually to ask them to look down the road and how you can adapt a lot of these issues, which in the end will be profitable. For example, if you were a company in the oil and gas sector working on wind energy 15 years ago, you'd be worth hundreds of billions today. By the way,
sorry to interrupt. I think you raised a very important point, which is probably also of interest to other listeners, is the way in which the investment community has been waking up in recent years, particularly to the sort of the ESG part, but also now to human rights as well, that they see good performance in ESG as a driver of profitability. And the obverse, the reverse is also true. If you get it wrong, you're less attractive as to investors. And I think you're seeing some of the huge institutional investors, particularly in the West, really taking this stuff very seriously now. They see the link.
In fact, a conversation I had with UBS in Geneva a couple of months ago, exactly on this, when the investments, the modest investments that I had, they were convincing me to go into their new sustainability fund. And they said, do you know what that means? And I said, well, I have some ideas. It was quite an interesting discussion. But that fund has been doing much better, actually, in the last few months than the standard funds that they've been portraying. But of course, investments can go up and down in any way. You never really know. Green is in right now, but it could be out again. You know that as well as anybody else. Sorry, Harsha. You keep asking. He's a very nice guy. You keep asking me nice questions, which I've been working on all morning. So it's really helpful for what I'm writing on right now. The book should be out anytime soon. Happy for you to see it and give me your thoughts, Ron, because I'm sure that and I'm sure they'll be very critical as they should be.
I'm not the unofficial reviewer though.
Oh no.
Harsha?
Both very good. Sorry, Harsha, you're telling me to shut up. I should. Yes, done.
Okay, we have many questions lined up over here, so I'm sorry for that.
No.
Some of the questions are very relevant and pertinent, so that's why I need to intervene. One of our viewers, Mr. Senthil Kumar, has raised a question on there are companies that still do not allow the refreshments during the daytime for the workers, and we educate world or companies to respect humans at first for triple bottom line, but the implementation is a huge problem out there. So how do you police the police? You see, even if they have some monitoring system, how do we still ensure that they are in place?
It's a very good question, and it costs money, but you need to do two things. One is you need to train your internal auditors to really be looking for the right things and asking the right questions and imposing action plans to rectify issues that they find. So you need to invest in your internal auditors in order to go and do proper auditing. And a proper audit is not just something that lasts half an hour, and it, in some cases, it can last days, depending on the size of the outfit, and ask the right questions. Many companies also use independent verification agencies as well. So you don't actually have control over what their verdicts are, but they have the credibility of being an outside company going in with a fresh pair of eyes and asking the right questions to ensure that they get the right answers, and then you can put in place, based on what they say, you can put in place action plans to rectify the wrongs that you find. And some of them are very basic, and some of them are like refreshments during the course of a day. Well, that's not going to take very much to change. Others, or making sure exits to factories aren't blocked, that there is access to fire extinguishers, that dust levels are brought under control, that the right kind of PPE equipment is not only there, but is actually used. Some of this stuff is very, very simple. Other stuff is a lot more complex. I can't hear you.
Yeah. So in the times that we are living in, what are the key observations corporates should consider while bringing their employees back to work, especially after the COVID? And what is the present focus of GBI HR, and what kind of stakeholders are they looking forward to collaborate with in times to come?
So the first question first, I think of prime importance are workers' health. And I mean, not just physical health, but also mental health. So I think these are issues that really need to be front and center of every human resources or senior management person's minds when they bring people back to work. How safe is it? Is it a long-term benefit to bring people back to work, or will people get sick? What precautions do I have in place? What obligations am I placing on people? Will they have to wear a mask? And these kind of things. Will they have to socially distance? Can they do that in the circumstances in which they work? Is it feasible? So I think, and people's mental health as well. The stress of the last couple of years and some of the terrible tragedies that have happened and are continuing to happen. What kind of mental stress is this putting on people, and will they go sick as a result? So I think that should be front and center of every manager's mind. Managers always say people are our greatest assets. Well, now is the time to actually prove that to be true and put people's interests first. As to your question about the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, we have a number of areas of focus. Supply chain is obviously a very consistent area, but one of the areas that we're focusing on at the moment is how to do downstream due diligence, how to do due diligence of your customers. Very difficult issue. How are your customers using your products? Are they using them in a way which is not what was intended? So mechanical equipment may be used for military purposes, for instance, or stuff may be abused as well. What kind of questions can you ask of your customers that you already ask of your suppliers? And what kind of leverage do you have to ensure that you get a full and truthful answer. And in some cases, it's very, very difficult indeed. And in other cases, you need to band together in a collaborative initiative with other members of the same industry to try and force truthful answers and change where you see that it's necessary. So the idea of collaboration as a means of leveraging change is an issue that all companies in the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights are thinking about and looking to see how they can introduce, or at the very least thinking about the positive impacts that can have.
Wonderful. Now, last but not the least question. IICSR is an online institute to develop responsible business leaders presently and in times to come. We are grateful to you for conducting the course on CSR and human rights in January 2022. What are the other courses we should conduct, and how do you think we can break the language barrier in reaching out wider audiences in this space?
So I think it's a good question. A fundamental issue which arises in business and human rights is conducting due diligence. How do you conduct effective and serious due diligence on human rights impacts? And I think that's a course that's available and very, very important to do, because unless you actually know what kind of impacts you have, and you can only really know through conducting serious due diligence, everything is for nothing. It's just a hollow conversation that we're having. So work on human rights due diligence. Work on supplier audits, really important. What is an effective supplier audit, and what is just a PR exercise, a tick box exercise? For me, those are two of the key issues. Then there are other issues like managing your impacts, like water. Obviously, a huge issue in India and elsewhere. Access to water, pollution of water, non-replenishment of water resources used in industrial processes. So there's a course to be had there on the issue of water management for corporations. Due diligence, auditing, water management, there's a whole list of them.
Wonderful. That's quite a lot of work that we have to do in the coming year, and it's a lot of things. Now, I would like to firstly thank you for taking so much of time from your busy schedule and sharing all the wisdom and the knowledge with us and all our viewers presently watching and will watch later. Any final words for all of us?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would love to spend longer talking to your colleagues and the people listening in, because I think the conversation could become much more granular and specific to their daily business activities as well. So, as you know, Harsha, the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights is ready to support your work in January with this course. And then let's see whether there are other individuals who are currently online or listening who might like to approach us for other bits of advice as well, or other conversations.
What are the other areas, if I may ask, that you would consider to work or collaborate upon?
Well, how to carry out due diligence, which is of prime importance. How to report effectively. We all know the difference between serious reporting and public relations. and a lot of what I read is public relations. But though how to report on your dilemmas and how you approach issues is really important as well. It adds to your credibility for a start. So reporting, I think, is another way of another area of potential interest. Every company is different. Every organization is different. You just need to look at your business model and your value chain and apply a human rights lens, and you will see so many issues there, some of which you may well have got under control and feel comfortable with, but others you feel less certain about. And it's the ones that you feel less certain about that I feel where I feel that we can make a contribution.
Wonderful. It was a pleasure talking to you, Ron, today. And I'm sure all of us enjoyed the conversation. And Dr. Michael Hopkins, how are you there? Thank you for joining us as well. Thank you, Arunji, also. He's in the studio right now. And thank you to all our viewers to have joined us. Thank you so much. Namaste from India.
Namaste from Switzerland.